I'd like to welcome you all to tonight's KOOBDOOGA program. This is our third community read event related to our choice book of our River Lost by Blaine Harden. Laurie, I'm very excited to have Laurie here. I have been misrepresenting her for the last 2 weeks, and I'm really glad she's going to straighten me out. I've been telling you wrong information about her paddle. I'm very excited to see her show. But before I do, I just want to thank our sponsors, In Situ Boeing and Mary Hoyt and Bruce Stevenson Foundation. Bev Thomas and Cam Thomas have all contributed to making these events possible. We really appreciate their financial support. Also, a special thank you to the Fort Vancouver Regional Library Foundation, the Fort Vancouver Regional Library, the White Salmon Valley Community Library staff, and of course, the White Salmon Valley Community Friends. That is the organization that puts the hard work in to make these wonderful programs happen. I'd like to invite you next week on the 28th of October. We'll have our final program of the season with KOOBDOOGA. We will be having a book discussion group on A River Lost, so please join us if you'd like to talk about the book. Now I'd like to introduce tonight's panelist. Very excited to hear her real story, not the made up one that I've been sharing with everyone. Washington native Laurie Wilhite began her kayak journey down the Columbia River just below the John Day Dam because she grew up in Goldendale. After retiring from a long teaching career that started in white salmon, she decided to get better acquainted with her home river, the Columbia. Seeing the Columbia River through the car window throughout her life during rush trips to Portland and to the coast was not enough to truly know the river. Laurie's paddle to the Pacific led her through the Columbia River Gorge, where she was raised, and on to the Pacific Ocean near Astoria, Oregon. This is the story of her adventure and journey of reflection of life along the Columbia River. Thank you, Laurie Wilhite, and I'm going to turn off my mic and take it away.
Thank you, Ruth, and I'd also like to thank the Friends of the White Salmon Library for having the sponsorship of this talk, and beautiful stained glass window is actually at the White Salmon Library, so thank you for that too, because it's very fitting. So I would like to start with saying that upon retiring from teaching, I decided to go on a journey and take time to get to know the Columbia River. I'm here tonight to share with you my love for that river and consider it my home river. And I'll talk more about that later. But my journey of reflection on life and my home river found me paddling, as she mentioned, from John Day Dam to the Pacific Ocean over several years. And so I did the paddles in about 15-mile sections when family and friends could join me. I wanted to show you that even though my book is ready for publishing because of the pandemic, it's a work in progress. And this is the cover draft of what it will look like. The title cover picture is me soloing under the Bridge of the Gods, and that was actually about 2 weeks before the Eagle Creek fire happened. This is a draft of the back cover of the book with an introduction that just says, Washington native Laurie Wilhite began her kayak journey down the Columbia River just below John Day Dam, and it led me through the Columbia Gorge, where I was raised, and onto the Pacific Ocean. So I'm excited about both the beginning and the end of this journey. The table of contents has 26 chapters in it. It ended up that way because each chapter was one of the paddles. And I had been asked to join a writers group, which really inspired me to come home from a paddle and write the stories. And without their help and support, I wouldn't have gotten this far, certainly not this fast. I also created a map for the journey because, as I mentioned, I did not do the river from east to west, as you might imagine a downriver paddle. I hooked up with family and friends when they could do a certain stretch. That's what we did, depending on the weather and the time. Our time together tonight will be divided into 3 sections. I'll be sharing stories and some photos from the book chapters because I'm really excited about the writing and the stories of the things that happened along the way, the flora, the fauna, the geology. And then thankfully, the second section you'll be entertained by my husband, Don Wilhite, who'll be playing guitar in the background as I just show you immersion slides, if you will, so you can just see and feel what it's like to be on the river in a kayak and up close. Then at the end, I'd be happy to answer any questions. As our son Fletcher Wilhite paddled many of the stretches with me on this journey, he was there at the beginning and he was there at the end also. He's here tonight to help with the presentation. So thanks for taking the time to join me, and let's get started. I wanted to introduce the whole presentation by saying that the Wilhite family is a paddling family of canoeing and kayaking. I met Don over 35 years ago, and we went on wilderness canoe expeditions in the North Cascades of Washington, up to British Columbia, Alaska. We took several classes on whitewater canoeing and other paddle skills. The education experience gave me the confidence I needed to take this long journey on the mighty Columbia River. As our two sons, Fletcher and Casey, grew up, we took them along on canoe trips to places like Long Island and Willapa Bay and the Ross Lake in North Cascades of Washington, and even the 70-mile loop of Lake Chain in the Bowrons in British Columbia. So they developed both canoe and kayak skills also. I mentioned this background for safety reasons when considering the undertaking of an adventure like my paddle to the Pacific. Paddlers should have a water skill set and follow safety practices that help ensure success. Our family motto is nobody gets hurt and everybody has fun. And I can't say we always have complete success, but it's a grand goal. So let's get right into some chapters. And so chapter 1, this is our son Fletcher, and we put in on the Columbia River east of Lyle with our Jackson kayaks. The dark blue one's a Journey model, and the light blue one's an Ibis. We paddled from the Bingen to the Bingen Marina, which is about 15 miles, and the first stretch of the paddle to the Pacific was complete. I'm going to read you just a small paragraph or so from that chapter so you can get a feeling for the book. We put our kayaks in a little cove just east of Lyle and paddled right up to an amazing rock wall about 20 feet high. Floating a kayak doesn't take much water depth and allows paddlers to get up close to shore. One of the best things about this low impact mode of travel is seeing the flora, fauna, and geology at the river level. The colors and the shadows of the rock wall create faces of ancient ones, monkeys, and abstracts of green, charcoal, and yellow. As we got up close, we could see tiny flowers with dangling pink blossoms growing in the cracks of the rock wall. We traveled on in the company of several pairs of Canada geese and stopped between two tiny rock islands by a channel marker below the lookout. A quick rest and photos were taken. The Bingen Marina was just a mile away and became our takeout spot. Don was there to pick us up right on schedule and helped load the boats atop our car. The wind had picked up as it usually does in the afternoon. It was good to have help loading the kayaks. Looking down the Columbia as we finished our paddle, we could see a huge green channel marker high up on one of the south cliffs. This navigation tool is universal, and the red right return chant simply means to keep the red channel markers on your right as you return from the ocean. We were on our way to the Pacific. So that's just a little bit of chapter 1. And so I'm going to skip ahead to chapter 3. This is actually the geographic beginning of the paddle. I decided to start at John Day Dam because that's just south of where I grew up, and it's my homeland and home river. I had chose not to paddle through the locks of any of the dams for safety and time reasons, but to get as close to them as was safely possible. So this is Fletcher and I putting in between some fishing platforms, and it wasn't long until we encountered some weed beds, and weed beds are a growing entity on the Columbia River these days because the river temperature has risen. And so there are weed beds of a variety of kinds. Even some are now toxic to humans and pets. As we continued on to the west, We paddled past Maryhill and the John Day Bridge, and soon we were approaching Miller Island. And this is an island where my dad used to take me fishing for sturgeon. There's a 90-foot deep fishing hole there against the rock walls. As Fletcher and I paddled ahead, you'll see him to the right of that rock formation. And we were taking the channel on the north side. As I came around the corner, the biggest surprise was, though, that he had managed to climb up the rock to give me a startle, and he did. And he's always been good at climbing things and jumping off of them, but I was really glad that day that he had chosen to not do the latter. So we continued on down around Miller Island, and as we came out of there, the wind came up so much that we were paddling. I was paddling, leaning forward as far as I could and hard as I could, and I was going backwards. So this is typical in the gorge, especially in the afternoons. So we called Don, who is our shuttle and been helpful throughout our whole journey, and he came and got us in Wishram. Shuttling is a big part of paddling, and so loading the boats on top is really another safety factor. We always have a bow line in the front, holding it to the front fender, and a stern line holding it in the rear. So chapter 4, we started where we left off, but we chose to start across from Wishram, hopefully a little more out of the wind. So this is a photo from just east of Celilo Park. Tried to do the journey continuous whenever possible in that way. As we paddled downstream, we came across the Wishram train bridge and very near where Celilo Falls used to exist. And there were bubbling currents coming up in certain places, and it was interesting to try and imagine the loss of the falls in 1957 when the Dalles Dam was built. We did cross from the Oregon side to the Washington side just before this point, and crossing the Columbia River in a solo kayak requires careful thought and at least a baseline skill level. Factors to be considered include river current, wind, obstacles, and river traffic, and sometimes even turbulence from the deep. We were in the middle of the river, surprised to find the barge that we had waited for was now stopped in the river also, probably in reverse, motoring to hold its position. It was rush hour at the railroad bridge as they raise and lower the bridge for the shipping traffic to pass. A fish transportation barge was just heading under the raised railroad bridge and had the right of way. It is by law that the boats have to yield to upriver traffic. These barges move the young hatchery fish where they need to be without the challenge of fish ladders in the dams, and the salmon runs are greatly enhanced by this busy transport service at certain times of the year. So that is a part of chapter 4, and we came to rest upon Brown's Island, which is at Avery, which is downriver past Miller Island and past Celilo Park, and took a rest break. At this point, we were feeling really close to nature and the river, and as I looked around, I thought that the sand coming down between the openings and the cliffs were no doubt where water from the Missoula floods came down several times, and that now really the sand had become sand falls of sorts, showing that the erosion over time and that all things come to the ocean and their own resting place. So I had a haiku moment, which is where you experience a moment in nature or somewhere that causes you to find a deeper connection. So I wrote a haiku on Brown's Island, and so I'll share that with you, but it's waterfalls of sand pass through these ancient rock cliffs. Time flows to the sea. That's in chapter 4. So at the end of the paddle, our sons Fletcher and Casey greeted us. It was Mother's Day, and this is at the Avery Park. And I appreciate their support throughout this trip. That evening, the sun began to set in the west, and it's a magical place. The Columbia River changes its mood as many times as perhaps we do during a day or a week. Chapter 6, we put in where we had taken off. So we paddled back out through from Avery and went out to Browns Island. And in the picture at the left, you'll see Horsethief Butte in the distance, which is part of the Columbia Hills State Parks, one of the largest state parks in the state of Washington, and also Mount Hood. But I would like to mention that while you spend time in nature and you get away from your schedules and out of the car and on the river, you notice that there are tiny worlds all around you also. So the lichen and the colors and designs on the rocks really helped me enjoy even more the experience. As we paddled down river, all of a sudden Fletcher goes, "Mom, wasn't that She Who Watches?" And I wasn't familiar that you could see it from the river. And so we turned around and paddled back. And sure enough, it was a new perspective for me, which again, this is a journey of reflection, of seeing things in a different way from a different perspective. So the reddish rock in the middle, I realize it's hard to see from this picture, but that actually is She Who Watches. So Fletcher was very helpful in interpreting and discovering things along the way. We paddled onward and began looking for the takeout. So I had been using a Fish and Map Company map, which is waterproof, and it's shows the water depth and the shipping channel and channel markers and all kinds of boat ramps, helpful things. And it's waterproof, which is a really good thing. But as Fletcher paddled, he was looking for the takeout, which was above the Dalles Dam, and a bald eagle flew right in front of us. And it happened to be the 4th of July. And I appreciated Fletcher's comment that, "Mom, it doesn't get much better than that on the 4th of July." So it was a fun moment. So back to the takeout. We had a bit of a problem. We looked upriver. Beautiful clouds change as the day goes and all. And that's where we had just come from. And we were ready to find our car, which was parked at Spearfish Lake. So Fletcher actually starts thinking about, well, where is the takeout? And our map had indicated there was a lake nearby, but we couldn't find the lake. And so we paddled closer, etc. And Fletcher basically had to drag our kayaks up off from the river level, up the bank, and up another bank and up to a lake that actually wasn't Spearfish Lake. It was the lake next to. So we paddled across that lake and then finally up another bank and got to Spearfish Lake. So in spite of careful planning, I guess my point in this chapter was that the takeout was a challenge, even though we thought we were prepared and relied on some maps. So the experience was much easier for me than it was for Fletcher. And I appreciate, again, that he helped me through that tough moment. I'm going to move on down the river now. And again, this part of the presentation, I'm just combining photos with reading you some passages from some of the chapter. But I have to tell you, I'm so excited about all the other paragraphs and parts of the chapters that are part of this story. It was hard to select bits and pieces to read to you to give you an idea, but I think that that's important since this is a book talk. So we're now at Cascade Locks, and I called upon some other friends to come and paddle a stretch with me. Cascade Locks has a wonderful recreation area to the east. It's called Easy Climb Bike Trail, and there's a little bay called Blackberry Bay. And so I met my friends Carla, who lives in Ellensburg, and Carrie, who lives in Eugene, and they came from hundreds of miles to meet me there. And Carla had just bought an inflatable kayak, and she aired it up, and away we went. And I hope you're able to see on the right-hand side of my screen how steep the put-in was. So it took us longer to even get in the river. Sometimes you think things are simple, and they're not, but that's the way life is. So we dragged the kayaks down to the Columbia, and off they went. And that's the Washington shore, Table Mountain and Red Bluff in the distance. And there's Carla and Carrie paddling towards Cascade Locks. half that mountain basically fell away in one of the largest landslides in North America. It's called the Bonneville landslide. And so all of the matter that you see in the bank on the Washington side used to be part of Table Mountain. That's actually what formed the Cascade Rapids. This is the site of the original locks that were built so that ship traffic could bypass the Cascade Rapids, which were huge. And you'll see the Bridge of the Gods in the distance. And so the wind came up and we fought, particularly against the strong afternoon wind, but we did paddle through these locks and we took out at the boat ramp, was just around the corner to the left. And then we walked over a bridge to Thunder Island. It's on the other side of the locks. And right behind us is where the Cascade Rapids used to be. So that's Carla and Carrie and I. This is the boat launch at Cascade Locks. We took out there, and the Marine Park Campground is a wonderful place that also hosts Pacific Crest Trail hikers and fishing people and RVers, and there's lots to do there. It's one of my favorite spots. Well, this is my friend Carrie and I taking out there, and I am sad to say that's probably the last time that I ever got to paddle with her. She passed away from Alzheimer's complications in the last year, so I miss her very much. But that's why if you go spend time with your friends when you can, it's a gift. Time is a gift. So the next day, I ended up soloing from here to Eagle Creek, which is just above the dam and the site of the forest fire that happened. In fact, I solo paddled past this area just about 2 weeks before the Eagle Creek fire ravaged this area. Carrie took the picture of me leaving from that boat ramp, and that's why I chose to use it for the cover of my book, which is called Paddle to the Pacific. So the next day, I soloed, and it was fun to paddle under the Bridge of the Gods. And what makes it possible for me to travel and shuttle to these trips all along the Columbia, so almost 250 miles that I paddled, is my Thule Elevator. And as you can see, it's a hydraulic device that it can lower your loading cups to waist height, and then you strap the kayak on and you can lift it up. So I can actually put that on top of my pickup truck by myself. And so it was so good I had to buy 2 of them. It's my retirement present, but it's good to have the right tools. Chapter 10, I called on another friend, kayak buddy, Deanne Horrocks, and we taught together in Woodland. And so we put in from Bonneville Dam just below Bonneville Dam, as close as we could safely get, and paddled to Prindle. So I'm going to read a little bit of that chapter to you. We had an interesting day that day. So when the going gets tough, it's time to call a strong paddling friend. Deanne is my saltwater kayaking friend who loves to play in the waves in the Pacific as much as an otter, seal, or porpoise. Our most recent saltwater paddle was at Netarts Bay on the Oregon coast. Previously, we completed a challenging 4-day kayak trip in the San Juan Islands in Washington State. She boogie boards, surfs, and has earned her scuba diving certification. This section of the Paddle to the Pacific required most of these skills, except thankfully not the underwater ones. As usual, the kayak put-in and takeout locations are key decisions to the success of paddling the mighty Columbia. They can change in the middle of a paddle because of weather. Daylight, distance, current, wind, even tides have an impact on the journey at this place in the river. Deanne met me on the Oregon side of the Columbia at Rooster Rock Park boat ramp to drop our vehicles, which is always the first part of a section and shuttle. You drop a vehicle where the takeout is. And so we plan to drop our vehicle there and paddle over there later in the day. The distance from Bonnieville Dam to Rooster Rock is about 14 miles. The paddle seemed just about right since we'd have a fair amount of current moving us along. It was in early spring and an east wind at our backs. In fact, I had scouted this location twice before, once in March while the Columbia was still at flood stage, and once in September when the Army Corps of Engineers was releasing a lot of water from the dam to help the Chinook salmon run. The river still had plenty of current now, and so we hopped in and away we went. At the parking lot at Hamilton Island, where we dropped our kayaks to put in, I put the car keys under a big rock by a chokecherry bush because I didn't want to risk losing them in a mishap. Strong river current passes through this narrow channel, and it was a bit risky. As it turned out, that decision about the key brought us good fortune later in the day. The current quickly drew us into the narrow shipping channel of the Columbia before Bonnieville Dam. Excitedly moving along quickly, we maneuvered around a handful of fishing boats, and fishermen along the bank seemed to be amazed by our kayak endeavor and wished us well. The steep canyons on the Oregon side of the river showed evidence of the recent Eagle Creek's fire destruction. Tendrils of smoke still swirled up from a few locations on the steep cliffs, covered now with charred trees. Dumps of red fire retardant from firefighting planes formed bands of saved and burned forest up the gorge walls. A red and green mosaic of vertical bands contained burned and living trees painted the gorge for 15 miles. The Eagle Creek fire, ignited by a careless teenager throwing fireworks from the trail across the canyon, burned 48,800 acres. Spires of charred trees like ghosts standing at attention now stand in rows on tops of many of the peaks. Years will pass before the toll on the flora and fauna at the Columbia River Gorge can be counted or even estimated. Much of the well-used trail system will need to be rebuilt before the area can be open for public use. We decided to take the scenic loop of the river that passes right below Beacon Rock on the Washington shore. To get into this northerly passage, we had to paddle between Ives and Pierce Island. Paddling in the fast-moving but shallow water between the islands was a bit sketchy, but we made it, and we were greeted by dozens of Canada geese resting on the sandy shore. We also spotted a pair of osprey, merganser ducks, a great blue heron, an egret, and a peregrine falcon. Beacon Rock is closed to rock climbing certain times of the year to protect these falcons that nest there. The monolith towered above us, standing 848 feet tall. It's the third largest rock in the world. Henry Biddle purchased the rock for $1 in 1915 and spent 3 years constructing the trail to the top. Thankfully, it doesn't take much water to float a kayak, and we were able to navigate through some very shallow spots. Before long, I needed a rest break. Scouting out a safe place to land on the shore in the swells and surf provided us with a bit of a challenge. We pulled up our kayaks to the beach for a lunch stop and realized that we had pulled them up across some really fresh bear tracks. One set of tracks was considerably larger than the other, about 5 inches across and 5 inches long, with inch-long claw marks pressing into the sand. We followed the mother and cub tracks up the beach while keeping an eye on the shoreline bushes. Coyote tracks soon joined the bear tracks, and we assumed that they were all after the freshwater clams, since the beach was littered with empty shells. A homestead apple orchard and blackberry bushes just up the beach east of the St. Cloud Park day use area helped us conclude that it was prime bear habitat. We looked to the river to consider how fast we could swim if we needed to. Feeling the need to keep moving on because of the building wind, we set off in the Columbia once again. Our goal was to paddle past Oregon's Dalton Point and visit the massive rock walls just below Cape Horn on the Washington bank. The building wind was a cold east wind, and it churned the river into an ocean of waves. We were able to surf the waves coming up behind us and stay on course by correcting with each stroke of the paddle. This is exhausting work. I was now sitting in a puddle of water in my kayak from taking part of the surf with me as I paddled. The additional weight of the water makes it harder to keep the kayak moving in a straight line and decreases your stability. I could barely handle the rock and certainly didn't want to roll in the middle of the raging Columbia while making a crossing back to the Oregon side. Based on my fear of tipping over in the icy river during the long crossing, Deanne, a much stronger paddler, even though could have made the crossing, agreed to abort our mission and change our takeout. So rather than risking crossing in that manner, we called Don, my husband, to come and rescue us. So he was working in the Dalles, and I appreciate that Deanne listened to my concerns. We always only paddle when everyone feels safe and up for the task. So plan B, we surfed into Rocky Cove just before Prindle to consider our options for a safe takeout. The waves were loud as they crashed onto the rocks, and whitecaps made the river roar. Landing safe and upright on the tiny beach, we noticed that Highway 14, the railroad tracks, and any other trails or escape options were not in sight. We could hear the traffic, but we couldn't see it through the woods. I had asked Don that morning if he would be working in the Columbia Gorge and help us if needed, so he came to the rescue. First, he had to find us. We weren't even sure where to tell him we were, except we were directly across from Multnomah Falls on the Oregon side. He drove to the boat ramp at Bonneville Dam, found the keys that I had hidden under the rock, and we met up with him a couple of hours later on the side of the road at the Skamania County Road Department. So Don had us, but we did not have our kayaks. So we drove down to Prindle to scout a takeout spot. And on a narrow road leading to a couple homes on a cliff, we found a local man who was out shooting squirrels called grave diggers as part of the property management in a golf cart. And he said he had shot 45 of them. Deanne thought he was a murderer because she didn't think he was talking about squirrels. She thought that he said grave diggers. And so he had a gun in the golf cart, and we were so tired that we got a case of the giggles pretty bad when we realized that it was talking about squirrels. Anyway, he offered us a ride, and he said, if you paddle around the point, you have to lug your boats up these stairs, and it won't be easy, but you can come out here at this location. And I believe it's really important to be sensitive to private property owners when you're kayaking when it's a public river, to keep that in mind. So Don dropped us off by the side of the road, and we hiked back through the forest, and we found our boats, and we paddled to this beach, and we found the metal stairs that led up the cliff to the rescue. This is bear tracks that I wanted to share with you that we had escaped from. So we escaped from one hazard to another. This is Deanne Horrocks, by the way, taking the video. Thanks, Deanne. So this is the beach where we were going to plan our escape route, and you can see that that's downhill from here. Here are the stairs that we had to carry our kayaks up in order to meet Don in the parking lot and get to safety. So carrying our gear first, we managed that, and it was one of our most challenging days. So at that time, the weather had changed, and in the book, there are a couple chapters that actually aren't about paddling, really only two. Chapter 11 was wintering off the river, and chapter 23 was setting up a group camp so that a bunch of people could paddle together successfully in Chinook. So my own, I'm going to read a little bit from Wintering Off, because I would say that my own paddle to the Pacific has taken longer than I originally thought. However, I'm not bothered by that. and have found that it is a journey less about length of time and more about my paddling companions, the nature of life along the river, and my own reflections over the last 60 years about the Columbia River and what it means to other people as well. We all see the river in our own ways. I'm experiencing a classic application of the saying, it's the journey, not the destination. My recent time off the water, this is chapter 11 from Wintering Off. My recent time off the water and investment in research has shown me that I'm not alone in traveling the Columbia River. Many people have successfully paddled the river to the Pacific Ocean, traced it from its source in British Columbia, photographed major portions of its 1,200 miles. Only about 3 dozen people at that time had actually paddled the entire length. It flows to the north at its headwaters in British Columbia for 200 miles, actually before it turns south and flows towards the Pacific. Some made the source to sea paddle in 3 months, continuously traveling downriver in a boat of some form. They're my heroes, and they provide intense inspiration for my own journey of reflection. As my paddle is a journey of introspection, starting where I was born rather than at the headwaters. Robin Cody made the entire source to sea trip in 1990. I attended his writer's talk in the Dalles at one point. He said that he believed that using as many of our 5 senses as possible helps readers and explorers feel the experience. He described the people and places he encountered downstream, and I wholeheartedly agreed with him and looked forward to getting back on the river myself. However, in winter, the Columbia turns from a beauty to a beast in some forms. This is Stevenson. This was not far from the Bridge of the Gods, where I showed you some pictures earlier. So I sat in my house and looked out my window. This is the view from my home in Goldendale. And the Columbia River is about 14 miles from there. So over the Columbia Break Hills. And I would think about the river and if it was a good day to paddle or not, and watch the weather and continue to watch the weather. So in my book, it's chapter 12, and it's called Back in the Saddle Big Time. So Deanne and I went back to St. Cloud Deus Park and decided to tackle the stretch of the river that goes by the Cape Horn Cliffs. And so this is Deanne heading over to the cliffs. And it was 43 degrees that day, and we think the water temperature was 43 degrees also. And Deanne doesn't like to wear hats much, but she did wear 2 hats that day. And I have to say, for safety reasons, we wore wetsuits just because of the cold temperature of the water. This is a quote from Paul Schullery, who is a prolific writer, and one of his books talks about the home river. A home river is that rarest of friends, the one who frequently surprises you with new elements of personality without ever seeming a stranger. So I'm going to take you to the waterfall now. Thanks. To let you see what it feels like to be on the deep green churning waters of the Columbia and having a magical surprise. Thanks, Deanne, for that feeling of what it's like to be there. Her husband, Gary, bought her a waterproof camera, video camera, and so it was very helpful. I just also wanted to mention that this goal of paddling to the Cape Horn Cliffs, I learned about that from a friend's son, Matt Waddell. He was wearing a wetsuit and he soloed from Bonneville Dam to Astoria the year before that in a kayak. And while landing for a lunch spot near one of the waterfalls at Cape Horn, he took an unexpected swim and was thankful for the wetsuit. He said he had stopped there for lunch and he put one foot on his boat and one foot on the bank. And we know that that can be a challenging situation. But he was by himself, he soloed. So it was very, very smart that he had a wetsuit on. Okay, so now we're going to skip past Vancouver and up the turn of the Columbia River where it heads north, which are really fun experiences too, but I'm going to go ahead to chapter 22 and some of our experiences on the lower Columbia River. And there actually is a lower Columbia River trail that's very organized and a wonderful resource for people who want to paddle who might not be that familiar with other maps and put-ins and takeouts. So Aldrich Point is pretty much across from Skamakawa, Washington, and Aldrich Point is in Oregon. And the John Day River is not the John Day River that those of us who live in the more easterly gorge might be. John Day was an explorer, and so therefore there were several rivers named after him. So this one paddle was completed with Gary Horrocks and my husband Don and Deanne and I. And as we paddled there, again, unexpected joy that you can find when you get this close to the river were the pelicans. And they came closer and closer. And they actually, the whole string of pelicans flew right over us, which was wonderful. So moving on down the river, then from the John Day River, we took on another section. Started at the John Day River, which is a put-in. And we were going to go to Hammond. I had decided, obviously, not to go all the way to the Pacific Ocean because it's treacherous at the mouth, as you'll see later, but to get as close to it as I could safely. So our friends Mark and Cindy came from Seattle, and this is Fletcher, Cindy, myself, and Deanne, who became the paddling team for the day. And Cindy's husband, Mark, was gracious enough to work with Don to be our support on the shore, because as the difficulty of the paddles increased, it's really important to have people have your back and help you and love you. So a calm day, it started out. This is the John Day River, and it's just a short paddle down the river to the mouth. And at the mouth, there's this really nice abandoned railroad trestle. And once you go through there, you are out in the Columbia. This is a sample of a nautical map, and there are many available. But this is on the wall at the Maritime Museum in Astoria. And if you haven't visited that museum, I would encourage you to. It's a wonderful showcase of the Coast Guard and the history of the area. So you'll see on that map, just in general, that Clatsop Spit was our targeted takeout. And that's on the far left, the Skinny Peninsula right at the mouth. You'll also notice the line in the center of the map that shows the Astoria Bridge, which is like 4 miles long. So it's a wide river at that point. And the tide comes in very strong, and you have the river current at certain times of the year more so. And you have a shipping channel with huge ocean-going vessels. And you always have the unexpected in various forms. So we put in and had been looking for a place to rest, and it's a chain of islands, lots of wildlife refuge. So this is a sample of Fletcher. We rested where we could. You couldn't really get out, and so sometimes you need a break. So we have to take it wherever you can. So as the afternoon went on and we paddled towards Astoria, the waves began to swell and we rested, and you can see the swell ahead of Fletcher's Kayak. They start and they build, and again, some of it's from ship traffic, some of it's from the tide meeting the current, etc. This is looking west from Tongue Point at the shipping channel. Some of the ships are not moving, they're just stationed there awaiting their pilot guides up the Columbia River or to offload or load cargo. We took another break at the marina in Astoria because we still had to paddle under the Astoria Bridge. As the bridge loomed closer, so did the shipping channels. We became more and more in proximity to that. At this point, Don and Mark were to the left on the shore, relaxing, watching our progress on the Oregon bank there, and Cindy, Deanne, and Fletcher and I continued to paddle and paddle. You'll notice the orange bag on the front of Fletcher's Kayak, and that is a throw bag. And so it's, again, important to be prepared for the worst and hope that it never happens. But it's designed so that if someone is in the water, you can actually throw that bag to them, and it's coiled up rope inside so that they can hang on to the rope and you can pull them to safety. Again, the ships got closer and closer. So while Cindy and Fletcher paddled over to say hi to Mark and Don, Deanne and I got into an intriguing long conversation. And we were so enthralled in the conversation that I heard bells and didn't know where it was coming from. Thought it might have been Mark and Don ringing the bell on the shore at the lookout. But actually in the end, this huge shipping cargo vessel had come up right behind us and we didn't hear it. They were very quiet in the water. And that was their alarm bell telling we two kayakers to please get out of the way. So it's not always good to stop and have a conversation in the shipping channel. Well, it's probably not ever good to stop and have a conversation in the shipping channel. So here I am going under the Astoria Bridge, and that had been a goal that I had wanted to accomplish for a long time as part of this paddle. There's something about paddling under a bridge and the change in perspective. It's a place you've never been before in a way you've never seen it. So we continued on. So then we had to regroup and we had a bunch of people come. And so chapter 23 is not about an actual paddle, it's about our group camp. And so Deanne grew up in Chinook and was familiar with the area. And we had friends come hundreds of miles to help do these two challenging sections. We had to consider and plan for favorable weather, the daily tide changes, who was going to paddle what kayak, and what gear did we need, the act of camping itself and the fun involved, food, of course, and fun. Thankfully, we have the system for traveling with a kayak. You'll see for safety's sake, again, we have a bow line that prevents the boats from moving. And it says 2 stern lines in the back that keep that. And my truck is called Vinny, if you see that in the chapters or I mention it, because he's the color of red wine and very sturdy and has taken us many miles. So here's Vinny carrying our kayaks across the bridge at Astoria, and we headed back to the camp after our rough day of paddling. Relaxing on the shore near the campground, just as right at the campground. It was just so beautiful at sunset, and the mountains that you see in the distance, that's actually Cape Disappointment on the Washington side, as is Chinook. So the next morning, we're heading for Hammond, Oregon, and that's a trip back across the Astoria Bridge. And again, we were in the shipping channel and big open water. So being in the shipping channel, again, not only the safety, you'll see the throw bag. Now I have it on my kayak because we would take turns. You'll notice that we're in swells and that Deanne has the blade of her paddle in the water. Kayak skills are really important to be competent at and learn. So again, that's a stability thing, that she has her blade always in the water. This is part of why I didn't paddle all the way to the ocean. As you can see that the waves at Astoria are formidable. And this is crossing the shipping channel. So again, you can see the waves and the swells coming up against it as we head to the takeout at Clatsop Spit. Clatsop Spit has a really great parking lot. So Mark and Don were there waiting for us as we were very tired, but we paddled ashore. So that's Don and I with the ships on the sand. And there's Mark and Don at the beach as we came up and tried to land as eloquent as we could in these kind of waves, long sets of rolling waves. So getting out of a kayak and moving water has its own set of challenges. So we had made it through to Astoria. And Deanne took this picture after we had a nice dinner. And again, these are some samples of what lies beyond that point. The waves on the picture at the left against the jetty. And so I had said I was going to paddle to the Pacific, and I had, but I had not finished the journey yet. So the last chapter that I'm going to talk about, and then we're going to change gears, is the last chapter, upstream finish from Home Valley to Drano Lake. So I would like to read a little bit from that chapter just to give you a feel. And thank you for bearing with me through the reading, but I want you to see how the river speaks to you as a writer, and you can describe and see things that you've never seen before. It was not mere coincidence that the last leg of my paddle journey was the 7-mile stretch past Wind Mountain. It was tied to geology, weather patterns, and living almost 100 miles away from the put-in. Without success, I had tried many times to find a windless day to complete the stretch of the river. Having paddled the rest of the river from John Day Dam to the mouth, some 250 miles, I was more than ready to make a go of it if it wasn't even a windy day. And as you can see from the picture, Fletcher took this after climbing Wind Mountain to show the nature of the river there. Fletcher drove from Seattle Friday night to finish the journey with me since he began it at John Day Dam several years before. He had paddled the Jackson Ibis kayak on river stretches during both hot, smooth water days and brisk, turbulent saltwater waves at the mouth of the Columbia. I have paddled my Jackson Journey kayak the entire series of paddles, except for one canoe section. It may not have been the lightest and best boat for me to manage during this long river journey, but I was determined to finish with my trusty blue kayak. The unwelcome west wind was already kicking up by 6 in the morning on June 15th. It was predicted to continue steadily and increase throughout the day. While delightful news to windsurfers and kiteboard sailors, I was gathering my courage to paddle against the wind. Our new friends, Joseph Jones and Connie Hofferber, had offered to take up the challenge of paddling past Wind Mountain with us to complete this journey. They used to run an outdoor camp on Canoe Island in the San Juan Islands and became experienced kayakers. I eagerly accepted their offer and was glad that they chose to move to my hometown of Goldendale. We all camped in Stevenson the night before in order to beat the wind on the river. However, the wind made an early appearance. It was about 6:15 in the morning when Joseph came over to our camp with a cup of coffee and offered an alternative idea. If our paddle speed is 3 miles an hour, he said, and the headwind will be picking up steadily from 7 miles an hour based on the forecast, what if we reversed our direction and paddled upstream? One of my favorite sayings is that I always take all the help I can get, to the extent perhaps a fitting verse for my tombstone would be, she took all the help she could get. Who doesn't need help? I've lived a wonderful life surrounded by friends who enhanced my levels of fun and success with their knowledge and skills. Honoring that lesson didn't take me long to decide to trust Joseph and give it an idea a try. We all agreed, which is important, and so we drove to Home Valley to scout the river conditions before making our final choice. Once there, we observed a river that seemed to be flowing to the east, not to the west. because of the wind. Whitecaps were already raging, so we hastily unloaded our boats and changed the takeout to our put-in for this paddle. The small cove at the Windsurfer Beach in Skamania County Park in Home Valley was just a short walk from the parking lot. It was nice to launch in a protected cove, knowing what we would face ahead. I needed to make a few phone calls about the change of plan. A small collection of dear friends planned to greet us at the finish of this paddle to the Pacific at Home Valley. I now had to let them know that the takeout was the put-in and to meet us at Drano Lake, 7 miles to the east. One other person needed to be notified who would be at the finish, a traditional Scottish bagpiper. Yes, as a daughter of Marion McPherson, growing up with the love of the pipes, it was an appropriate way for me to celebrate my finish. Having notified the welcome team of our reverse order, we set out on the Columbia. This is our camp in Stevenson and how calm it was the day before. So here is Joseph and Connie and Fletcher and I at the put-in at Home Valley. Thanks to Don for taking the photo and supporting us with the shuttle. And right away, we had rough water. So Fletcher's taking on the waves and it continued to grow. You can see the swells in front of my kayak, and it was really fun to surf them. Connie had some experience doing that before and was easy to pick up. If you get sideways in a kayak in a wave like that, there's not much hope for not turning over. So we paddled upstream and Wind Mountain is on the left and to finish at Drano Lake. At 8 a.m., both walls of the gorge lit up pink with the sun's ascent. The colors and shadows on the rocks and tree-lined passage formed a spectacular mural. No time to rest now. Big rolling waves were coming from behind, making it tough to stay on course. I had to keep the paddle in the water nearly all the time. Wind Mountain was behind us now, and we rested for just a bit. This area of the Columbia River Gorge is aptly called the land where rain and sun meet. In fact, the town of White Salmon has used the phrase as a slogan for decades. Behind me to the north, I began to see white swirling clouds on a sea of blue sky. Considering the huge winds aloft, they too were moving along to their destination. Not completing this river journey in order had always been in my intent. However, I hadn't planned on paddling any of it in the reverse direction of the river. This was the day, and it was working out very well. The cliffs at the left and in front of my boat were actually at the bottom of Dog Mountain, and my Fish and Map Company map said that the water there is upwards of 80 feet deep. So it was really fun to have a map with the interpretive extra information on it. And again, I couldn't help taking a close look at the rocks and the geology wonders of the area for the last time on this paddle. Here's Fletcher waiting for us underneath the bridge that's the entrance to Drano Lake. We arrived a half an hour early, and there was Rory, the bagpiper, there to greet us. Just to show you how windy it was. At that time, I had decided to dedicate the book to my mother because of her challenges along the river and her service to others. So the closest I could find is, this is a picture of the ferry that was at Hood River White Salmon about 1917. That was the year my mother was born, and still cost $2 per car to cross. And the photos from the collection of the Historic Museum in Hood River County. But it's similar to the one that my mom was on when she was a child at Maryhill. And she always kind of had trouble with water and the river, but her story was that she was a child and the river cable that's underneath for the ferry broke, and it started drifting. The ferry started drifting downriver, of course, and Celilo Falls could be, the roar of Celilo Falls could be heard in the distance. It was about 5 miles away. So the men on the boat took it upon themselves to pull up the planks that you see in this ferry as an example, and they used them as oars, and they actually saved the day by paddling the ferry to the shore and getting the people off. So she never had a really lucky experience with boats. Anyway, I decided to dedicate the book to her, and I'd like to thank Rory for coming and doing that for us. He was a good sport. It was a very windy day. And I'd like to close this section of my talk with a poem that my writer's block friend, Pat Walker, wrote for me as she read these chapters and helped edit them in support. It calls me with its song. It helps me. It lets me rest. It strains me. It fights me. It tests me. It shows me no mercy. My river, the Columbia. Without you, I would never be complete. So thank you. I would like to introduce you to Janet Walraven, who helped me, is the editor of my book and will help me get it published. And if you're interested in knowing when that is available, you can email me at wilhite@gorge.net and I will email you and let you know that it's ready to go. But apparently a lot of people wrote the book during the pandemic. So thanks. Now it is your time to get to relax and listen to some guitar music and see the pictures from the river.
It appears we're having technical difficulty getting the music on. Bear with us. We're going to try to get the music on. Enjoy the slideshow, though. I'm sorry about the music.
The library issue.
That's what I understood. And that's what Ruth told me she was gonna do, because she didn't have good internet from Goldendale.
They're gonna have the photos so they can't do the other,
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine.
Mute.
You're trying to deal with.
Yeah. Like that's
And I asked Thank you, Laurie. What a wonderful way to end celebrating our river and our community. Read about the beautiful river that we live along. If anyone would like to ask questions or comments, please put them in the chat. We're not going to open the mics up, so I apologize to those of you who've raised your hands. Here I am back in front of the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. Laurie did a wonderful job. I really appreciate all your comments. I'm really looking forward to your book. I can't wait till we actually can get our hands on it. One question that's come in is, what surprised you the most along the journey?
Thank you. I would say the thing that surprised me most was the enormity of the river. I always have seen it from the car, but to be on it and see how far it is to the other side or to the next takeout. And it reminds me that oftentimes in life, challenges look bigger to us at first with adrenaline and all that. But in the end, if we pace ourselves, we're able to conquer them.
Thank you. Another question that's come in is about your cell phone. Were you really able to communicate with your cell phone while on the river?
Thankfully, I was, and I have to say that I have the same cell phone now that I started the journey 3 years ago. I cannot believe that it did not go in the water one time and I did not tip over, but thank goodness for that.
One of our viewers wants to know, what was your favorite stretch of the river?
My favorite stretch of the river is hard to name, but I have to say that Rory the bagpiper and discovering that the river journey was complete, and the friends that came that day and also in other ways supported me. It was a culmination of a long journey. So that would have to be my favorite stretch, although there are many others.
So my question is, if you had one word of wisdom or words of advice to someone who might be interested in taking this challenge, what would you say to them?
Obtain paddle skills and have really awesome friends.
And wear a wetsuit. Any other questions? We've got a little bit more time. Most of the comments are just thanking you, and I really want to thank you. I also want to thank, I believe my friend Portia here is on the call. She's the one who connected us to you. So thank you, Portia, if you're still with us. Beth says, thank you, Laurie, for giving me a perspective of the river that I had not experienced. It's so different to be on the river than speeding along on the highway. Yes. I really enjoyed seeing the river from so many different perspectives. Not being someone who's likely to get in a kayak myself, I enjoyed your photos. Congratulations on your fortitude to accomplish this feat. I have kite surfed most of your sites, and my favorite was the narrow, fast river below Bonneville. I was actually sort of curious about the paddle by Celila Falls. Could you just tell a little bit about maybe what was going through your mind as you were paddling over that area?
Of course. Fletcher and I, as I recall, we floated backwards underneath that train bridge and just took a moment and thought about it. And again, 1957 was when Celila Falls disappeared. And the churning of the water, there must be submerged rocks in some form below there. And it was a loss. And so I guess I felt the loss as we paddled through there, because I thought about how many people's lives it changed on that one day. Oftentimes change happens over time, such as with geology, millennia and things. But certainly on that day, it was a short change that had huge impact.
Someone asked, wow, Laurie, I learned so much and I have so many things to talk to you about. Photos and music was great. That's from someone named Diane. I can't see her whole name, but I think you know who that is.
Yes, I used to talk with her.
And Gary asks, would you make any gear changes if you were to do it again? And would you do it again?
Well, perhaps I might get a powerboat and explore the Upper Columbia later on in life, but I've, been there, done that. I still love to paddle, and gear is an important thing. I would have a dry suit, a wetsuit of my own, because thanks to Gary and Deanne, I borrowed their gear when we go boogie boarding in the ocean, or in this case around Cape Horn. It's nice to share your gear, but it's nice to have your own. A dry bag is essential and works only if you have it closed and your items inside of it. So I think a great invention is neck lanyard that you can put your cell phone in and still take pictures through. That's a pretty handy gear.
Okay, last chance for questions.
I have a really brief summary when you feel that it's time to wrap up.
Well, questions have stopped rolling in, so if you want to wrap it up for us, it's been a wonderful program. I'm just so thankful that we had you as our final program on our book about the river. Except for the book discussion, don't forget, come back next week. Let's talk about the book. But go ahead, Laurie, why don't you wrap it up for us?
All right. Well, I was just going to tell the story about as I began on this journey and realizing it was going to take longer than I thought. I dyed a strand of my hair blue, and I know this is silly, but I have this blue braid, and because it took so long, I now have this blue braid that represents the Columbia River to me, and that I'm on a journey, and that I was going to at one point cut it off and throw it into the ocean and complete the journey, but my journey didn't, as you know now, did not end at the ocean. But and I just kind of wrote an epilogue saying that now over a foot long, the braid has doubled in length since I completed my paddle journey. But it reminds me daily of my completed journey adventure. And at one time, I did plan to cut it off, but I've decided to keep it as a reminder of my accomplishment, at least until I finish getting the book published. So now when my truck Vinny takes me from home down the Columbia River to Portland and beyond, I can't take my eyes off the river. The views look different to me now, more intimate as I trace the path of my kayak along a particular stretch and remember where I was and what that day was like and who I was with. Remembering what it felt and looked like to paddle a particular place brings back wonderful memories. So that will always stay with me. They resonate inside my heart and are no doubt deep part of guiding me to the way I want to live the rest of my life.
A beautiful way to end a lovely program. Thank you very much, Laurie, and your entire support team who's here with you. I really appreciate them all. Thank you, Fletcher, for your technical support and getting that music working for us. It was really beautiful. I guess I have no more words other than more thank yous. So long and have a good rest of your evening.